I recommend it to the House.
I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, members of the public listening to that contribution from the National Party member Jackie Dean, well, if they're still awake, would be forgiven for thinking that this was just a small technical bill for which they should switch off, get up and go and make a cup of tea. Well, Mr Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. I'm sure Mr Ardern will take a call and give us the benefit of his wisdom on the insights into telecommunications. What I can say, Mr Speaker, is that members of the public need to see this bill in the context of its companion bill, the GCSB legislation, because it's all very well for government members to talk about the technical amendments and how this definition hasn't changed or that definition hasn't changed. The context, Mr Speaker, for this piece of legislation was the passing of the GCSB bill, which widely expanded the powers of the GCSB and fundamentally changed its purpose from being an agency focused on looking at the activity of foreign nationals to being one that can look into the activity of New Zealand citizens. And the moment, Mr Speaker, that change is made, the fundamental nature of the GCSB's work changed. The implicit contract that New Zealanders have had with our security agencies changed, and this bill, this legislation, is the legislation that operationalises those changes. They are fundamental changes to the way our security agencies work, and it should be being given a far greater attention by the National Party. Mr Speaker, I want to say two or three introductory things about the context in which this legislation is being passed. We are in an environment where not only is technology changing rapidly, but the way in which people use technology is changing. And alongside that are daily revelations from around the world about the extent of surveillance, the extent of the work of intelligence agencies, the level of technological sophistication that those agencies are able to employ. And that's what's changed. For Jackie Dean's benefit, in the 9 years since this legislation was passed, the world has changed. And in Europe right now, we have governments hugely concerned at the activities of the United States. And this government wants to bury its head in the sand. We've got congressional inquiries in America that are heading towards tightening up what intelligence agencies can do. President Obama wants to tighten up what intelligence agencies can do. And the response of the National Party to that? To broaden the powers of intelligence agencies, to make it easier for them to involve themselves in anything from, as Claire Curran has pointed out, the design of a network in a school library, all the way through to the operations of companies in New Zealand. The National Party has buried its head in the sand to what is happening in the world. And New Zealanders know that the world has changed when it comes to security, but the national government hasn't done that. And the world has also changed in the way in which people look at privacy. The question of, in this digital age, what does privacy mean and how do we balance privacy with security? Because both, Mr Speaker, are vitally important when it comes to a democratic society. We cannot have a democratic society without privacy. We cannot have a democratic society without security. But it's not, as Claire Curran said in her speech today, one or the other. And it's this false dichotomy that the National Party have pushed through. It's either you believe in security or you don't. That's it. Well, it's not that simple. What New Zealanders expect is a balance between privacy and security, that our basic rights and freedoms to communicate with one another without the state interfering will be upheld alongside keeping an eye on those people who will undermine our society. It is possible to do those things without balance those two things together. But the National Party has failed to do that, Mr Speaker. This bill tips that balance. This bill pushes more power into the hands of ministers, more power into the hands of the GCSB, and takes away from New Zealanders fundamental rights and freedoms that they should be able to expect. And Mr Speaker, that's the tragedy of this bill. I would have thought the National Party would have wanted to increase confidence in our security and intelligence agencies, because at the very time at which they have chosen to expand these powers is the time at which the GCSB, who play the critical role in the implementation of this bill, it is a time in which public confidence in that organisation is at an all-time low. And in the GCSB bill, we were asked to accept by the Prime Minister that the limits on surveillance of New Zealanders would come as a result of the way he would go about implementing the law. Not putting it in the law, but his promise to the House about how he would issue warrants. Well, that's not good enough, Mr. Speaker. What New Zealanders need to know is that the intelligence agencies of this country are acting in a way that is in accordance with our values as New Zealanders. That's why the Labour Party has been calling for an inquiry into our intelligence agencies for some time. And it's not just about the GCSB, it's also about the SIS. And in the context of this bill, we are seeing hugely extended powers to agencies the public no longer trust. The government should have slowed down. It should have listened to the concerns of New Zealanders. It should have undertaken a review and brought back to this House legislation that has the support not only of a wide range of parties in this House, but of New Zealanders in general and of civil society. The government has failed. It is out of touch with the concerns of New Zealanders on this bill. Mr. Speaker, the problem specifically with this bill is that it does create broad, sweeping powers. All the groups who came to the Select Committee said, don't do this. Don't do this for the sake of the privacy of New Zealanders. Don't do this for the sake of innovative businesses in New Zealand being able to get on with their job. And to see company after company come to the Select Committee and say, don't pass this legislation because it will stifle innovation. And the government, supposedly the friend of business, ignores them and ploughs on no matter what, saying, no, we're going to do this. That kind of arrogance, that kind of being so out of touch that they won't even listen to the people who traditionally have told us that they support. Mr. Speaker, one of the major concerns the Labour Party has about this bill is the broad definitions that are contained in the bill. And it is actually ridiculous to hear Amy Adams get up and tell us that there's no change around national security. Well, that's actually not true to begin with, but also, again, it's in the context of what is now defined by the GCSB is what they can do for national security. We then have the question of network provider, service provider. Both of those are so loosely defined, Mr. Speaker, that we do have the situation in which it is possible that schools, universities, hospitals and so on end up being caught up in this. That's the kind of sloppy legislation that we have in front of us today. Mr. Speaker, we also do not have adequate oversight, and the Labour Party attempted to see the establishment of a technical advisory board, so at the very least there would be some kind of oversight from people outside of the Minister's control, and again that was rejected by the government. Mr. Speaker, I want to finish my contribution on the matter on the submission of the Human Rights Commission on this bill, because that highlighted two things. The first of them was the arrogance of the Prime Minister, whose reaction to this submission was to tell the Human Rights Commission he was going to cut their funding. Well, he should have read it, Mr. Speaker. He should have read it, and he should have understood that the Human Rights Commission, using their statutory power they have used only a handful of times in their existence, were crying out to the government to say, you've got this wrong. You've unbalanced human rights and security, but the government ignored them. And in that report, Mr. Speaker, from the Human Rights Commission, the Commission actually says that New Zealanders believe that they are entitled to know if there is mass surveillance of them, that they need more clarity and information and transparency. And they believe that there should be a thorough investigation of all of the agencies before any such law as this is passed. Mr. Speaker, the Human Rights Commission was calling out the government on a piece of law that tramples over the basic rights, freedoms and values of New Zealanders. Instead, the government has pushed through the GCSB bill, they have pushed through the TICS bill against a global tidal wave of concern. They need to stop, they need to listen. Instead, they have gone ahead, and New Zealand now has law in this area that is now outside the mainstream of world opinion. It puts at risk the privacy of New Zealanders, it puts at risk the innovation of companies in New Zealand. It is a dreadful piece of legislation that should not pass.
I call the